Thank you to everyone for joining us. We're going to get started in just a moment. Before we do, I just wanted to make a quick announcement. When we are finished with the lecture, we'll have a short Q&A session. So at any time during the lecture, if you think of a question, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to go ahead and type it in. If you would like to read it yourself, you can note that, or if you would prefer that I read it, just let me know and we will take care of that at the end. I think, Sean, we can go ahead and get started if you want to introduce today's lecture.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Mary Beth, and welcome everybody to the School of Architecture here at the University of Notre Dame. We are extremely delighted and pleased and honored to be joined this evening by one of my dear friends and colleagues from Washington, D.C., Mary Kay Lanzillotta. And I'd like to just briefly introduce her before we turn the floor over to hear her remarks. So Mary Kay Lanzillotta, FAIA, is a partner in the firm of Hartman Cox Architects. She's been responsible for managing complex institutional and historic projects in Washington, D.C., throughout the country and internationally. For over a decade, Ms. Lanzillotta has directed the renovation and restoration of the Donald W. Reynolds Center for American Art and Portraiture, home of the Smithsonian American Art Museum and the National Portrait Gallery, a National Historic Landmark, and one of the most important Greek Revival buildings in America. Additionally, she's worked on the restoration of the Lincoln and Jefferson Memorials, the American Pharmacists Association, and the Hay Adams Hotel, all in Washington, D.C. And she's been working recently on the restoration of and renovations to the House of the Temple and the National Gallery of Art. Her expertise also includes higher education projects, including a renovation and courtyard enclosure for the Anheuser-Busch Hall at Washington University in St. Louis, Rouse Hall at the University of Virginia, and the Moorhead Planetarium addition and renovation at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her work has been published in numerous periodicals and journals, including Architecture Record, Traditional Building Magazine, Inform, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the San Francisco Chronicle, among others. And in 1991, she founded the Architecture in the Schools program within the Washington Architectural Foundation. And in one of her very personal moments of great deep pride in the transformative power of architecture in Washington, D.C. She was awarded the John Wiebetson Award for Architecture in the Public Interest in 2006 by the same organization, the Washington Architectural Foundation, in recognition for her work and dedication. Within the Washington chapter of the AIA, she's held numerous offices, including chapter president in 2000. And she was recognized with the Young Architects Award in May of 2000 that year. In 2008, she became a member of the prestigious AIA College of Fellows. And in 2018, the Washington chapter of the AIA further recognized her with the Centennial Award, the highest honor of the chapter. She received her Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Virginia and her Master's of Architecture and Certificate in Historic Preservation from the University of Pennsylvania. And following graduate school, she was a U.S. ICOMOS Fellow in the Soviet Union. She's NCARB certified, a registered architect in the District of Columbia and 3 other states, as well as a LEED accredited professional. So a very robust and impressive resume. And again, it's my pleasure to have Mary Kay Lanzillotta with us tonight. Mary Kay, we turn the floor to you.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you for that very kind introduction, and I am thrilled and honored to be speaking with the current students at Notre Dame, the faculty and alums, many of whom I've had the privilege of working with over the years. So with no further ado, I'm going to attempt to share my screen, and we can move on with the lecture. So Hartman Cox is about a 55-year-old firm or thereabouts, maybe 56 at this point, founded by George Hartman and Warren Cox in Washington. We currently have 4 partners. As Sean said, I'm one, but we also have Graham Davidson and Lee Becker, who have been with the firm. I think Lee at this point is the longest employee of Hartman Cox. He started in 1974 and hasn't left. Graham arrived in 78. So I'm new at when I arrived in 1989, and Scott Texera, a recent addition to our firm, came about 1998. On the left image here is our offices in Georgetown. We are living in two row houses at about 1815, 1820. None of the floors are level, true, square, or plumb, which makes for some interesting visits. This is the interior of our office. I was telling Sean before we started, post-COVID, we decided we would renovate the offices before we came back. So the offices at the moment don't look like that. We're getting new ceilings and lights and carpeting and furniture. So we'll all be coming back in November, and we're all anxious to see what it'll look like when it comes together. But this is what it looked like until about 2 months ago when we tore it apart. We like building models. We like sketching. We use all of the contemporary tools, but George Hartman used to say, if your only tool is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And so we try to use all of the tools in our toolboxes. Now I'm going to really delve into preservation, but our firm does a range of projects in the public realm primarily. So I'm not going to show you any single family houses. It's all public realm. This first project is the District of Columbia DC Bar headquarters. So this is the headquarters for the attorneys. They do a lot of public programs and education for their members. These are the renderings we created, and then here is the actual building. One of your alums, Brian Farrell, worked on this project. And so I wanted to make sure I did a call out to Brian and Notre Dame. We really love your alums and having them work with us. Again, lots of communal spaces in this building and educational spaces. Another project that is not terribly far from you, University of Michigan Law School. We've done a lot of work up there, Collegiate Gothic, York and Sawyer. But sometimes you need to add new things to historic structures. And so in this image, this is a new entrance to a courtyard enclosure that you'll see in a minute. And this bridge that links the tower to Hutchins really was solving a life safety problem, but it turned out to be a really good move. And so we took what had been this sort of exterior courtyard between all these lovely buildings and created this new enclosure that allowed for better circulation, solved some life safety problems, created a community space where the students didn't previously have one. Oh, and by the way, it references the Gothic architecture with the tree forms, but it is not duplicative. And we'll get into that a little bit more when I start talking more about preservation. So sometimes it's preserving the character of the place that is important, in addition to meeting the current needs. Because the best thing we can do for these historic older buildings is keep them in use, because we're not filling landfills, we're not creating new challenges. We're really doing the best thing for the environment by reusing our existing structures. Sometimes, though, a new structure is required, such as the Van Cise-Simonet detention headquarters in the downtown Denver. So this is the Mint, if you're familiar, and you'll see the new courthouse across the way. They wanted a building that fit, that was a civic building, but it's basically a big jail with about 1,500 beds inside. But they didn't want it to look like a jail. So the idea here was to use limestone. A value engineering suggestion was brick. It turned out to be more expensive. So using good quality materials is a benefit. It actually has two courtrooms in here. So it's a good place for the public to come. And it is across this corridor, across this plaza from the courthouse that I'll share with you. I can get this to move. So here again, this is the courthouse, and this is our detention building. We worked with two other architects on this, Richie Green and Oz Architecture from Denver. But it was a real collaborative effort and an important city planning, urban planning project. So again, here is And one of the things we did is each of these are light courts. And so these are the outdoor exercise areas for the detainees, and then the courthouse is beyond. So I'm going to use some terminology this evening, and I just want to make sure we're all operating on the same understanding with regard to preservation. So there have been lots of early preservation efforts at the local level, but the actual law, the National Historic Preservation Act, did not get instituted until 1966. And the important part of this is it really codifies how public buildings and heritage buildings are addressed with regard to preservation. And so this applies for both the federal and the private and the state level. It created the National Register of Historic Places, as well as the National Historic Landmarks Program. So the Landmarks Program is a higher level of integrity of the building and a more significant building. It also created something that you'll hear me refer to, the State Historic Preservation Officers, or SHPOs, as well as the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. And it really helps to define how we treat historic structures. Now, within that act, there are several different sections. The one that I deal most often with is Section 106, and that is the process by which federal properties are reviewed at the local and state levels, primarily by the state historic preservation officers. So I'm working in Savannah right now on a federal building. It has been reviewed by the local Metropolitan Planning Commission, as well as the State Historic Preservation Office. Fortunately, everybody agreed to our design approach, so it's not going to the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, although that is certainly sort of a level that you elevate it to. And as part of this, they created the Secretary of the Interior's standards for the treatment of historic properties. And this was designed to be, I won't say a generic document, but it needed to be a document that had flexibility, that would work equally well in Guam on a small residence, as well as Washington, D.C. or San Francisco. And so it was intended to be more adaptable and flexible. The way it has been interpreted recently, it's more literal. And so that sometimes creates friction between the review parties. And so that creates some interesting drama. There are some terminology, though, you'll hear: preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction. And those are the treatments for the historic properties. Generally, our work tends to fall in the rehabilitation realm, although even within that, we often preserve certain areas, or we restore certain areas, or in a couple of instances, I'll show you where we reconstructed things based on the historic documentation and precedents. And the federal government requires that if you're going to work on historic federal properties in particular, you need to have a minimum requirements of a license to practice architecture, as well as experience. So we don't want new architects or people who don't understand how to deal with historic structures to test the waters. It really does require a lot of experience in thinking about the way these structures were put together originally. And so within our office, we've got a number of people that are working with me on different projects in order for them to gain the experience that they can to keep moving forward. So now to the fun stuff. The first project I want to share is the Patterson Mansion. It's McKim, Mead and White, 1903. It was designed for the Patterson family from Chicago. And this was their winter residence in Washington. Again, marble base, terracotta, lots of exuberance of the Gilded Age. This is the Piano Nobile, where all the public rooms were, and then the residences, the bedrooms were above. This was the nursery, and this was the servants' quarters. It was sort of groundbreaking. It sort of came at the time that DuPont Circle was being developed. And so you can see it taking shape as they're putting in the roads around DuPont Circle. A significant house for a range of reasons, not the least of which Sissy Patterson here on the left. President Coolidge used the residence in 1927 when the White House was being renovated, and one of his guests was Charles Lindbergh. And so this house is on the National Register of Historic Places, in part because of its association with the Coolidge and Lindbergh. And then on the right, another photo of Sissy Patterson. We looked to these photos as we're doing the renovations because they often tell us things that are extant or missing. So here, Sissy Patterson dies in 1948. She leaves the house to the Red Cross. They sell it to a women's social club, the Washington Club, who in turn adds on to the building with the Kai's Lethbridge and Condon building. Fast forward, Washington Club is closing down. Their membership is dwindling. They're looking to sell the property. About 2013, 2014, a number of developers look at it, but we were fortunate to work with Saul Urban, and they secured it and are returning it to a residence. But we needed to do all the things that a 110, 15-year-old building needed at this point. And so we laser scanned the building. We went in and documented the condition of various elements for restoration. We climbed the roofs. We looked in the gutters. We pulled out the original drawings to try to understand some of the conditions that we were seeing. This is terracotta. We needed to figure out how to best clean it so that we didn't do damage to it, as well as repoint and repair it, because some of the terracotta glaze had failed and was crazing. In areas where they had added that addition, we weren't quite sure how they connected it and what we were going to find, but we knew we would need to replace some windows, recreate openings. And so our design, we took down their addition, wanted to restore this elevation as much as possible, and then add a new addition to the east, separated by 14 feet, using similar materials and proportions to the historic house. So this is all one project, but doing it in a way that complemented the historic and certainly did not distract from it. That's always our big concern. We want the original fabric to maintain its integrity and its significance, and we don't want to do something that will detract from the original as part of the process. So here are some post images. You can see we've separated the building by about 14 feet and created a courtyard. The existing entrance, you would come up a series of steps, and then there were more steps on the inside. So we're using this connector piece not only to allow people to move back and forth between the addition and the historic residence, but also as our accessible entrance. Another view of the addition. Again, we tried to use the proportions of the original. This is all a curtain wall, so it's very different, but we think it's a good sort of background building and doesn't try to upstage the historic house. And a view from the courtyard looking back. So this is that elevation that we had to clean and repair. We recreated some windows, we repaired and recreated some missing terracotta. So I want to take you inside for a minute. So all of these spaces are restored. I did not choose the paint colors. I'm going to say that right up front, because I wouldn't have done some of the things that the interior folks did. So you come up to the top of the stairs, but we were able to retain the original railings. All of the moldings were retained. To this piano nobile level, the ballroom still serves as a central gathering place. We did need to add some glass rails to the balconies, but we did it in a way that we think is unobtrusive so that we could keep people out using. This is the dining room from the Washington Club days. And the dining room today, it is still used for meals for residents in a communal setting. This was the library. So get ready to have your socks blown off. Didn't pick color. I did, however, get them to put an isolation layer between the original wood and this black paint because I told them they were probably not the last ones to paint this room. We restored all the floors, we kept the moldings, we upgraded all the infrastructure, the life safety. So here's the ballroom, again, from the Washington Club days where the windows were closed in, and this was the door that led to the next addition. Here we've recreated the missing windows. So here's another example of recreation based on the historic documentation to bring the daylight back into the room the way it was originally intended. And again, we restored the musician's balcony here. Essentially, each of the bedrooms became its own living studio apartments. Again, we reused fan coil units under the windows and the old radiator boxes, and tried our best to conceal all of the things that you need for 21st century living. In the attic, we actually were able to create a couple of units with these mezzanines that allowed for a double height space. And then from the addition, looking back at the historic house, you really get an intimate feel and get up close and personal with the residents. Around the corner is 1789 Massachusetts Avenue, another historic house. This was the home of Andrew Mellon while he was the Secretary of the Treasury, and then again while he was setting up the National Gallery of Art. And his apartment was in this 5th floor area. This is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and then in 1976 it was elevated in part because of the Mellon Association to a National Historic Landmark. The National Trust for Historic Preservation used this as their headquarters for about 30 years. But again, in about 2011, 12, they were looking to sell the property and move, find a good steward for the property, which our current owner is. And so as part of it, though, they kept a perpetual easement. So this is the original floor plan. Each floor was its own apartment, 11,000 square feet. You would come up the stairs to a foyer with a living room, dining room, salon, and then residences. As part of the sale, the trust retained a permanent easement over all of the rooms and the facades that are street facing, but they agreed to allow some flexibility in the back of house spaces, which was essential because we had a lot of dead-end corridors and life safety issues that we needed to address. And so here you can see the retention of the street-facing rooms with some minor modifications. The other thing we did, just as we talked about with the Patterson, the whole building envelope here, the windows needed repair. They were original, but they were wood and they were in need of care. The masonry is limestone, also in need of cleaning and pointing, which is replacing the mortar between the stone joints. We also needed to create an accessible entrance. And so again, much like the Patterson residence, you come up a few stairs to a sort of mid-level, and then you have to go up again when you get to the entry. And to try to make that accessible, we were going to do a lot of damage to the historic. And so working with the DC Historic Preservation Office, we came up with this idea of essentially lowering the sill of a window and creating a new entrance off of P Street into the primary corridor. And what you can't see here is there's a glass lift that brings you up and in. So this new entrance that we created off of P Street provides a secondary means of accessing the public spaces on the primary floor, but also creates our accessible entrance, which is really important for the property. So here again, before and after of the windows that needed care, this porte cochere, the doors and screens had been changed at some point, but we found historic drawings and we recreated the screens on the doors. At some point, an elevator was added in the middle of the stair. We removed the elevator and relocated it, and then created a new railing that allows the stair to really shine again and encourage people to use it. We recreated the windows that had been into the light court. There is no light court, but we backlit them in order to bring some daylight. We removed 3 columns to create a larger auditorium space on the ground floor and a renovation zone. And to do that, we created the story truss that spanned between the 2nd and 3rd floor, so we could take out the columns on the 1st floor, make no small plans. We also excavated under the building, holding the whole thing up on stilts to create a lowered basement level for mechanical equipment. And that was an interesting undertaking, sort of MC Escher's, anyway, interesting, challenging. We managed to not crack the stone, and we restored all the primary spaces on the 1st floor, repurposing living rooms for boardrooms, dining rooms retained as dining spaces for the tenants. This is that new space where we took out 3 columns above with the story truss to create this larger auditorium space, but kept the more intimate foyer spaces, restored transoms where they had been removed. We got them to hold all the furniture for the office spaces away from the walls so that the whole interior soared. And we added a roof terrace on the top, which you really can't see from the street level. Sometimes we're working in important historic contexts, like we were here in Mobile. There was a historic courthouse, but we needed to add a new one that met the current conditions. And so here, that was our rendering, and this is the completed project. So this is a district court. Once this building was finished, we moved everybody out of the historic courthouse into here, and then we repurposed the historic. So this is all new, but they were very clear in the brief that they wanted something that looked like Mobile, and it felt like Mobile and belonged in Mobile. And so this is all Alabama marble, quarried just in the northern part of the state. But this is your entry into the federal courthouse here. And then this is, there are 3 levels of courtrooms. And so here you come off the elevator into the waiting space, into one of the courtrooms. Very sort of different approach. It was a part of the General Services Administration's Design Excellence Program, and my partner Lee Becker was the designer here. And once everybody moved into the new courthouse, we could go back and renovate the historic one. So this is, the original design was from 1934. It received a very early edition, as you can see. They added on back here in 1939, 1940. 80 years later, it had its windows replaced. The building had a lot of mold issues. It needed to be cleaned and pointed and repaired. This is me up on the lift doing my due diligence, making sure we know what the conditions are so we can carefully document the repairs. So post-cleaning, new windows, we did paint analysis to determine what was the right color for the spandrels. We added accessible entrances. There was no accessible entrance to the main door. On the interior, before we started, you would come in and you would have to go through this gauntlet of security that intruded into the primary corridor space. So we moved that to an anteroom so that the primary lobby space was once again as it was intended. This is the 1940s courtroom that you can see up here. Something is missing. It had the diffusers, but originally there were supposed to be some light fixtures. I went into the drawings in the building engineer's office and found the shop drawings for the original light fixtures. And so we were able to recreate them. We cleaned and repaired all of the interiors here. This was actually the original location of the 1934 courtroom. It received a facelift in 1966. I'm not exactly sure facelift is the right word, but it was renovated in 1966 and this paneling was put in. But the judge who was going to reside here in the bankruptcy court really didn't like this courtroom. And he said, "What did it look like originally, Mary Kay?" So I went back and I found the historic drawings. And then I said, well, I wonder what's left underneath that paneling. So we did a little selective demolition and found that the original pilasters were still there, but the wainscot had been removed. So we showed him what a rendering of the new space would be, including adding the falling stars and the bench. And he somehow managed to find the money to allow us to restore this courtroom to its original glory. Again, we found the original shop drawings, and Carl Holden in our office was instrumental in making this happen. We finished this project in the middle of COVID, so I snuck down there to do the final punch list, but we haven't been back to actually document this, so I apologize. This is an iPhone image, but you can get the sense of what we were able to recreate. So this wainscot's all new, but it's based on the detailing. We recreated the falling stars sculpture that was missing, but we were able to restore the pilasters and add back the original coffered ceiling that had been removed in the 1966 renovation. Again, things that are important to us are making sure all public buildings are accessible. And so they had been an accessible entrance, but it was on the back side of the building. So bringing it to the front was really important. And that allowed us to restore the original entry here, repaired the doors, restored the windows. And then also in the archives, I found the original shop drawing for what was supposed to sit on the cheek walls out front. And we actually found there are a lot of these in the federal collection. We worked with somebody in Philadelphia to go down to Baltimore and scan one, laser scan it in 3D. They made all of the molds, and then we had them recast and reinstalled on the building. So today, this again was my sneak down during COVID punch list photo. So they weren't put in, but they have subsequently, and it's pretty darn amazing. So that's another small recreation piece, but we think it really brings a sense of scale that's important to this city. I think maybe one of the last projects I'll share with you is down in Chapel Hill. So Chapel of the Cross is a beautiful little chapel here. It's Thomas Eustace Walter, probably 1840s. Hobart Upjohn added a larger church in the early 20th century, but they had no space outside the nave where the entire congregation could gather. And so they wanted an addition that was deferential to the two historic structures, but that would allow them to be able to have everybody that sat in the nave at a meal inside. And so we created this double height space in our brick addition, which is subservient to the two original structures, but created this nice space that has been used for everything from meals to yoga to school groups. They have never realized they needed this space as much until we finished it and they started using it. But we didn't want to lose all of the old, and so we salvaged one of the original fireplaces and rebuilt it, and they do use this in their parlor, and then a view back from the Botanic Garden next door. I think probably one of the last projects I will share is another one here in DC. This is George Washington University Museum and the Textile Museum. This is on 20th Street and G in the Foggy Bottom neighborhood. This is the historic Woodhull House. It is the reason General Woodhull gave GW this property that helped it move to the Foggy Bottom neighborhood. The relationship of GW with the Textile Museum was a new one. The Textile Museum was moving out of the DuPont Circle neighborhood and looking for a new home. And so all of the buildings at GW that are more civic in nature are the limestone buildings, as opposed to dormitories or classroom buildings, which tend to be more brick-like. So how do we add a big box of a building adjacent to the historic structure and not try to upstage it? Oh, and by the way, we needed to link the two together because that's part of the project. So textiles don't like a lot of light. So we basically created this form, but in public buildings, it's really helpful when you have a space that links the different levels together. And so the curve that you saw on the outside is our stair on the inside. So it's a central orienting point where wherever you are in the building, you can find the stair and know how to get up and down through the building. And then we created this bridge between the new museum and the historic house, which tends to be used for smaller scale exhibits and things that are more suited to the residential scale. Now, again, all of the building systems, the lighting, the fire protection, the life safety, the mechanical systems, all of that had to be upgraded, including this railing, which we actually recreated the rail, raising it up in order to meet the current requirements. And so at the base here, you can see we retained the original newel, but put it up on a pier in order to give it that additional height. And on the exterior, all of these brackets have been removed and this attic story enclosed. And so you missed seeing these original windows that were in the servants' quarters of the historic house. And so by removing all of the sheet metal, we recreated these brackets. But in the process, we were able to use these windows for some outside air to serve the mechanical units that are up in this attic space. So we restored the property and brought it up, but at the same time, really we're able to take advantage of some of the original design features that were lost. Again, a lot of research was done in the documents and looking back in the archives. So one of my current projects is out at the Air Force Academy. We are working on the rehabilitation of the chapel, Walter Nitsch, as part of the original. And so this is sort of the past is prologue. We are in the process now of taking off all of the original panels. And so when I was there a few weeks ago, they had about that much of the original structure revealed again. And we'll be putting it all back, but hopefully this time it'll be watertight and it won't rain on the inside when it rains on the outside, which has been the perpetual problem. So this is the project before we enclosed it. J.E. Dunn is the contractor and the architect of record is AECOM. They've put this in a big tent, so don't go visit the Air Force Academy Chapel right now. You'll be very disappointed. But we've removed all of the dalles de verre, which are the colored glass. That's being restored and conserved right now out in California. We are recreating these aluminum planks and panels. The organ, both at the Protestant chapel level and in Catholic chapel, which is one level down, are being restored right now. When I say it rained on the inside, I'm not kidding. All of these chests, these organ chests, were rotten from all of the water that had been flowing through them from the leaks in the building. And when I go back and I look at the correspondence from the original opening, they couldn't get the rain to stop. They just kept putting more and more layers of metal and sealant. And sealant is not a waterproofing. So it's been a real challenge. So when we are in the office, this is some of us. And I think I'll stop here and try to answer any questions you might have. And thank you for your attention and interest this evening.
Thank you, Mary Kay. If you want to unshare the screen, then they can see you better as we ask the questions. I wanted to, again, encourage everyone to use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen to submit questions. In the meantime, we have a few to get us started. So here at the school, obviously, we focus a lot on architecture and research. And certainly from your presentation, we can tell that there's a lot of research that goes into your work. How do you approach research, both for your restorations and also for the new buildings that you design?
Well, for restorations, we usually start when we can with the original drawings. We really try to get back to the archives for the original architects. If they are public buildings, NARA, the National Archives and Records Administration, has a lot of those drawings. And so we go to NARA, we search NARA. We also try to find the original construction photos if the building is of that period when there might have been construction photos. We work with contractors and owners to try to do some investigations as well, to try to determine the original conditions. The courthouse I mentioned down in Savannah, we created a long list of things that we wanted to know about so that we could understand the original design intents in some areas. So there's a drop ceiling below a historic ceiling. And so I just earlier this week got photos of, they finally cut through the drop ceiling and put a camera up, and I can actually see what, we expected to find. Of course, every 4 feet on center, they chipped away the plaster to put in a hanger to support power or duct work or something else. So it's going to be a lot of repair work, but our plan is to restore that ceiling as part of that project. So we do a lot of research. For the new project in Mobile that I shared with you, we walked the streets looking at all the historic structures there, trying to understand what was the essence of Mobile, and really tried to design something that was of the place, not necessarily of Washington, D.C. We don't want to be the architects that come in and try to change your place. We want to be the ones that enhance and contribute to the sense of the neighborhood and the scale and the importance. And so a lot of our research is doing just that, what is appropriate. And we look at local materials, look at the scale and proportion of the buildings that the neighborhood cherishes. Again, in Mobile, the neighborhood walked us around and said, this is really important to us. Don't mess with this. We like what we've got in certain areas. And so pay attention, please. And we try to listen. I'd like to think we are good listeners.
So that brings me to something that you can't really cover in research because it doesn't exist in the originals, but how do you approach the intersection between restoration and sort of adding the seamless accessibility features that are so necessary? I saw in the AEI building where you had removed the elevator to another location, and then the other place where you were able to move the accessible entrance to the front instead of the back, which is an improvement, but sort of what's the philosophy on balancing out those two items?
Well, it's a challenge, right? There is a standard, it's part of the Secretary of the Interior, I think it's standard 9, and it's the one I run up against the most. There is this notion that you have to be able to walk down the street and clearly tell what is new and what is old. And I worry that sometimes when you do things like that, it draws too much attention to the new, and the original suffers. And so I joke that sometimes I try to channel Robert Mills when another one of your alums, Debbie Nata Rodriguez, and I were working on the American Art and Portrait Gallery. I tried to channel, what would Robert Mills do if confronted with the same situation? Or when we were working at the National Gallery of Art, it's Scottish Rite, what would John Russell Pope do? Because I want them to look like they are of the place and of that vocabulary, even if it's a new construction. So the railing is clearly different. There's nothing like that railing anywhere on the building, but it is of that character of place. It's differentiated, it's new, but it is not drawing more attention to itself than it should. I think the same could be said for that accessible entrance. It's there, it's new, it's clearly a cantilevered structure. It's lightly touching, if at all, the historic. So if you know how to read a building, you would tell it's different. The Campbell Courthouse building that I shared with you, I can find the line where they added on in the 40s, 1939, 1940, but a lot of other people can't. There they felt the building was more important than any one architect's sort of ego. And I think in preservation, a lot of times you have to sort of check your ego at the door because you want to do what's right for the building and not necessarily leave your fingerprints all over it. That's my opinion. It's not everybody's, but that's our approach to how we deal with these structures.
And a question now came in from Devlin about, is there any particular exterior building material or architectural element that you find especially difficult to work with in a restoration?
I've been really fortunate. I get to work on a range of different buildings. So the aluminum at the Air Force Academy has been a new type of material. It was innovative at its time, and trying to figure out how to replace that in kind and get the same sheen and character, has been particularly challenging. But when we were working on the terracotta at Patterson, I had not done a lot of terracotta restoration, so I'm always learning. I think each material poses its own challenges, and finding really the craft that can help bring the vision that we have to fruition is sometimes the biggest challenge that we have. We had this one project where there were a lot of plaster vaults, and there were not a lot of plasterers that could do the plaster vaults. And so we had them work in the basement first to get sort of the flow and how you do this and how you finish it before they moved upstairs into the public spaces. But it's each different material, each different building brings different challenges.
So we have a question that came in, and the person that submitted the question went anonymous for the question. So it's going to be a good one. Is there concern at your office that putting glass boxes and functionalist panelized architecture next to historic fabric detracts from the historic character of the space, especially at the urban level? Might a humble traditional building in keeping with the character of, in this case, DuPont Circle, not be better?
You're talking about Patterson. That one, I think what we did there is sort of subservient and steps back from the mansion and the adjacent Iraqi embassy, which is also a historic property. And so could you have put in something more traditional there? Possibly. But in Washington, D.C., I don't think that was going to happen. And I think this creates a good background building that still allows the historic structures to be at the forefront. And I think that is really where we should be. We want to let those historic structures shine and have the significance and the prominence that they should. Certainly the Kaisleth Bridge and Condon Annex addition that they built in the 50s that was limestone, I just think it was using traditional materials and traditional proportions, but it wasn't a good neighbor. And it served a different purpose. So I think it depends is the right answer. I don't think one solution is the only, each instance requires a creative solution. And I think what we did at DuPont Circle is the right solution for that project. We've done other projects where, after 55 years, we've got a lot of projects. I didn't share all of them, but I think other solutions, putting in something that has more of the historical detailing is more appropriate. Certainly, that's what we did at Chapel of the Cross, which uses brick, it uses limestone trim or cast stone trim there. So I don't think one solution fits every situation.
So from the mansions in DuPont Circle that you've worked on through now, the chapel at the Air Force Academy, you're covering quite a range of eras and styles. Through your time with Hartman Cox, is there a favorite era for you personally to work on?
Every project is unique. I love them all. There's some that make me pull my hair out sometimes, but I don't know that I have a particular favorite. I was really fortunate to work on the American Art and Portrait Gallery. I had studied in my graduate work, I'd really focused on 19th century and had spent a lot of time studying Robert Mills. And so to actually be able to work on Mills buildings was fantastic. Really fascinating for me. So I loved working on that project. Plus, that project had went from 1836 to 1867, plus has an Adolf Klus renovation in the 1880s. I mean, I saw the entire 19th century construction methodology in one building. And all, from the austerity of Mills to the exuberance of Cluse, just a range of things on which to work. I love them all. And I really have been so fortunate to have these opportunities. I mean, the Gilded Age, it's a lot of fun, lots of energy there. I'll tell you, we worked at the East Building of the National Gallery of Art. And if you did not embrace the pay proportions and that triangle, it just would run you over. And so you have to understand where you are and the system in which you're working. And there's a lot of rigor, both in the historic and the mid-century modern. And I think it's learning to be flexible is the probably thing I've learned the most, and embracing the current project as it is.
I have another question that came from someone else, but before I forget it. So the firm's 55 years old. Have you had to come back around and renovate any of the early buildings that Hartman & Cox did?
So actually, we're in the process of doing that now. We finished a project down in the Penn Quarter, I think just as I was arriving in 1989. And the same owner has it, so it's now 30 some years old and loves the building, but it needed a refresh. And so he came back to us and asked us to renovate the lobbies, the main lobby, add a rooftop piece to it. We're working at the ground plane now. So yes, and that was Lee's project in 1989, and it's Lee's project again. So it's a lot of fun. And then there are projects that I worked on at the Lincoln and Jefferson that they're totally undoing, 25, 30 years later. So that's a little harder to watch, to have them take down something that you did originally.
So the question that just came in is, how do you deal with clients who are not too interested in the historical value of some of the buildings? And how do you establish a balance between pleasing the client and your responsibility to history as an architect?
It's interesting. We were working at the University of Michigan, and they have the Michigan Union building, which is Pond and Pond 1919 building that has seen a number of renovations. And when you listen to the folks who administer that building, they're like, well, we just need to clear out all of this stuff and it'll be great. And when I said, well, wait. We were working as part of a team, 2 other architects, workshop out of Milwaukee and IDS, Troy. And I said, wait, the things you want to do are the things that Pond and Pond had in the original building. And so we created a historic structures report, which was the guiding tool for preservation there. And we showed them what the original intent was and how following the original intent would allow them to create the spaces that they wanted to create today without destroying everything. And so it's a matter of educating, I think, the clients. You have to do your research too, but I think it's a matter of educating the clients and sharing with them sort of their role and responsibility as stewards as well. With the 1789 project, I got to tell you, those people are amazing stewards. That building needed a lot of care. But we often talk about stewardship and the role and responsibility that owners have when they purchase or have acquired these historic structures. Not everything is on the National Register, and those that are, it's even smaller percentage that are National Historic Landmarks. And preservation, you're preserving a number of things when you're working on these historic structures. You're preserving the building, certainly, but you're also preserving memories and the social interaction of the buildings and the character of the place, as well as remembering some historic events that may have happened there or historic people who have contributed to the broader cultural understanding. So a lot of it is education, but it does mean sometimes you have to stop and bring people along so that they are all on the same page moving forward. We like doing that too. Get to do more research.
it does seem like in the projects you show, you've done more work with sort of institutional civic engagement. Even, when you're working with private organizations, it seems like it's people that have been around for a while. Do you do much work that maybe just wasn't shown with developers or people who have more of a short-term view of things? Or do you find that the people who are attracted to your firm are more invested in the long term?
I think generally, even our developers, as I mentioned with the Pennsylvania Plaza, I mean, our developers tend to be long-term clients. Sol Urban will retain that Patterson house, I believe, for a long time. So they are, even the developer buildings, I believe, are more long-term owner types. The DC Bar headquarters certainly is one of those. But we do a lot of, we work in the public realm. So whether it's developers or higher ed or civic institutions, memorials, courts, we tend to like that work. We think it's important work that creates memories for future generations. But even our developer work, I think maybe they're attracted to our interest in the historic, but I think it's more creating a sense of place.
Sean, do you have any final questions?
Yeah, Mary Kay, I'm just curious for the students that are listening with us this evening that may be interested in historic preservation or entering that field, kind of in their career. What kind of advice in terms of things they should be on the lookout for, prepare for as they embark on their career and their continue education in this field?
Well, Notre Dame has a great educational model. So getting out and seeing things your third year in Rome is just a phenomenal opportunity. So I think the first thing is being a good observer will always help you. I see things on buildings that other architects don't see because I've trained my eye to look for those. But I think other opportunities the students should explore are working for the Historic American Building Survey, which is part of the National Park Service. They run summer programs where you can do an internship to measure and document historic structures. I think that's a great way to understand the buildings and learn about them and get some hands-on experience. I think you mentioned my fellowship for the US ICOMOS. I believe they are still doing that, hopefully post-COVID. That is sort of for an early professional, but if you're interested in historic preservation, they basically send you for a summer somewhere. And I was fortunate enough to go to the Soviet Union when it still was the Soviet Union, and work on essentially a HABS type Historic American Building Survey project there. So that's a really good experience. There is a summer Nantucket program that is run in historic preservation. So if you want to like dip your toe into historic preservation, I think there are a lot of opportunities to do that, particularly for young professionals. And then, consider working for a firm like ours, or there are firms like ours all over the country that are interested in both new and historic work, and try it. I think the one thing about being a young professional is you have the opportunity to try a number of different things and find your niche. I started working on large development projects for a different firm, and I didn't like it. It just wasn't the part that gave me, that I was excited about getting up every morning. And I don't have that problem now. I'm really fortunate that I love getting up and working on these projects. And I think that's really what's important, is finding your passion and following it.
Wonderful. Thank you. I think that's great advice. And I just want to say deep sense of gratitude on behalf of Dean Polyzoides and the entire school community here of getting a glimpse into your body of work and that of your colleagues, of an extremely reputable and well-known firm nationally and certainly internationally. And I think the incredible opportunities that you've had to engage in some amazing commissions, kind of once in a lifetime opportunities, including some projects that I know that you weren't able to share with us tonight. It's just a great glimpse into I guess, the reputation and the 5 decades of incredible leadership at Hartman Cox into a second generation, and probably what will be a third here in the next couple decades. So thank you for joining us this evening, and welcome to any concluding thoughts that you'd like to share before we sign off.
Well, thank you, Sean. This has been a great honor to share our work, and it's I've been watching the chat, and it's so nice to see so many familiar names popping up. You're right. We've been really fortunate, and we appreciate that, and we appreciate that, and we understand the responsibility. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and look forward to maybe being out at Notre Dame at some point in the future and seeing some of the students work firsthand. Thank you.
Absolutely. We look forward to welcoming you to your opportunity to be on campus with us soon. So thank you all. Have a good night.